Somebody's hurting my brother, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Did you hear? Somebody's hurting my sister, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody's hurting my sister, and it's going on. And we won't be silent. Did you hear? Somebody's hurting your children, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Yes, somebody's hurting your children, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Did you hear? Somebody wants to steal our health care, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody wants to steal our health care, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Did you know somebody's poisoning the water, and it's going on? Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody's poisoning the water, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Don't you know somebody wants to build that wall, y'all, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody wants to build that wall, y'all. It's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Did you know somebody's hurting our families, and it's going on? Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody's hurting our families, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Did you hear? Somebody's hurting this country, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody's hurting our country, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Somebody's telling lies, y'all, and it's going on. Yes, it's going on. I tell you, it's going on. Oh, somebody's telling lies, y'all, and it's going on. And we won't be silent anymore. Let me hear you say, and we won't be silent. And we won't be silent. And we won't be silent. Let's just keep singing that. We won't be silent. We won't be. No. No, 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 we won't be silent. Let's do it without the music. And we won't be silent. won't be silent anymore. One more time. And we won't be silent anymore.
Thank you. Those in the choir stand, I ask you to stay if you would. And if you have another part in the program, you can just come from there. Good to see all of you all. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I want to welcome all of you here today. Greg, come get this for me. I want to welcome you here today, and I want you to know who we are and why we're here today very clearly. We are not a left or right movement, conservative or liberal. Today, Greenleaf Christian Church and Poor People's Campaign, the National Call for a Moral Revival, are sponsoring this conversation. And we had a conversation in the summer, the Moral Poverty Action Congress. And 10 candidates came. We invited them all from both sides of the aisle, even the White House. And Mayor Pete could not come due to schedule. He really tried to. And I said to him, as we've said to all, we're welcome anytime into worship, but what we would like to do is then always after worship have a conversation about poverty. We are a movement concerned about the moral issues and the moral demand to fully address poverty and low wealth in this nation, and to address the interlocking injustices, systemic racism, ecological devastation, inadequate health care, the war economy and militarism, and distorted moral narrative of so-called religious nationalism, so-called conservative evangelicalism that ignores the central call of biblical evangelicalism, which is to address systemic poverty, justice, and oppression, and to do it through the ways of love and truth. We root our moral critique of systemic poverty and low wealth in the moral values and principles, first, of our deepest religious traditions. I would even dare say Orthodox traditions. There are over 2,000 scriptures in the Bible that say the central theme, the moral issues for a nation, should be rooted in how that nation treats the poor, the sick, the children, the women, the immigrant, and those often named as the least of these and the unaccepted. Those are not William Barber's words. Those are not some theologian's words, somewhere on the left or the right. Those come straight out of any fundamental orthodox reading of biblical text. We also root our moral critique of systemic poverty in the values of our Constitution. It is our Constitution that declares that we are to call to establish justice, promote the general welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense. That's not something way over here or way over there. you cannot read but a few lines into our Constitution without being confronted by the demand that the purpose of this country and this government is supposed to be the establishment of justice, the providing for the common defense, the promoting of the general welfare, and to ensure not division, but domestic tranquility. And you don't even find freedom in the Constitution. It's not there. Liberty is there. Liberty. That word, liberal, liberty, liberty. So I want first, before I go further, and I want to give some house rules. We invited all the candidates to come in Washington, D.C., and we asked all of them to be welcome. This is the house. We welcome them with applause, and once they're here, we then ask everybody to take out your pens, paper, and listen. This is not a partisan rally for any candidate. This is not about giving the biggest applause. This is a conversation for us and for the many, many thousands and millions that will hear it around the country. So that we might do that as we have asked, would we all now welcome Mayor Pete to the stage the way we do down south? And would you welcome my co-questioner, Minister Jonathan Hartgrove, all the way from Appalachia. I think, and we'll give you one. You may be seated. As I said, these are the values, our deepest religious values, our deepest moral values. And we believe these are the same moral fusion values that brought black and white people together with one another to push America to address abolition, women's suffrage, labor rights, Social Security, civil rights, poverty, unjust militarism. And the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, we are the only movement in the country that is building power and mobilizing with the central focus being addressing poverty and low wealth at the center of our political discussions, not on the margin, and the interlocking injustices. We're the only movement bringing black, white, brown, First Nation, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, people of faith, people not of faith, gay, straight, young, old, from the Delta of Mississippi to Maine, from Alabama to Appalachia, from the Carolinas to California, from Kansas to Kentucky to Arkansas, the flatlands of Texas to the hills of Virginia, to say that America can no longer ignore the central issue of poverty and low wealth. So we are here to address poverty and low wealth, I want to make sure the media gets this, as a moral crisis. Since 2016, we have seen a pattern that has played out not just in 2016, but for 50 years. Debate after debate, and we don't have one debate that focuses on systemic poverty and low wealth. 26 times in 2016, not one. Or connects those things to the interlocking injustice. We see a pattern that must be broken in America, where we see euphemisms used to describe the poor as though we can't say the poor. Euphemisms like the working poor. Well, what else are the poor doing? What? Euphemisms like those who are trying to make it into the middle class. No, this movement has gone and seen the people who are literally poor and low wealth, and they are not ashamed to be called poor. They are ashamed of a nation that won't address it. Too often, Democrats run from the issue of poverty and try to find a way to talk about the middle class and wealthy. And too often, Republicans racialize poverty as though it is some kind of sub-issue that's only affecting people of color, and then even further, people who don't live a certain way. Our movement launched in 2016 with 26 national moral revival tours across 26 states. In 2017, we built 40 state coordinating committees made up of poor people and low-income people, because we believe in the agency of poor and low-wealth people, not folks speaking for them, but people speaking for themselves, clergy, religious leaders, and advocates. In 2018, this movement held 6 weeks of nonviolent direct action at 40 state capitals and in D.C., 5,000 people delivering our moral demands to both sides of the political aisle were arrested in those 40-some states. In the District of Columbia, 50,000 people participated in person. Let me have my cane. And on June 23rd, 2018, 35,000 people showed up in D.C. to declare they were the founding members of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And I joined my co-chair, the Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, a New Testament scholar, a Caucasian Armenian, who co-chairs this work. It trended on social media across the nation with more than 27 million tweet shares, and more than 1 million people viewing our live streams. We are now building out 30,000 contacts and participants in each of the 43 states and the District of Columbia that we can engage via social media or other ways at any time. We had over 1,000 people come to the Moral Political Action Congress. We've developed the Souls of Poor Folk Auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign. And now we've developed the Moral Poverty Justice Budget. We found the money. We found out folk are lying when they say we don't have the money. We found how the money can happen and you don't have to even raise taxes. It's not a scarcity of money, it's a scarcity of will. We found the money and we presented that budget with poor and low wealth people from Kansas, Pennsylvania, California, and Alabama to the Finance Committee, of the United States House of Representatives. We are currently on a 25-state We Must Do More. Yolanda, do you have those up? We Must Do More flyer. We must do more. Mobilizing, organizing, registering, educating people for the movement who vote. And on June 20th, I need to see Yolanda, on June 20th of next year, 2020, we will have the Mass Poor People's Assembly and Moral March on Washington after the primaries, before both conventions, to drive the issue of addressing systemic poverty right into the center of the political narrative in this country. With all of our coordinated committees now, and over 15 national religious and denominational groups and 120 partner organizations, we are building towards this Mass Poor People's Assembly Moral March on Washington, and we are building a sustained movement, not just for one election, because we believe something is more at stake than just one election, as important as it is, but who America is electing to be. And will we elect to continue to be a country that ignores the plight of 140 million poor and low wealth people? We are rising to change the narrative, to speak truth to this nation with the ethic of love and justice, and to demand action. We are rising to register and mobilize the poor and low wealth, who in many places represent the group that, if mobilized, could change the political calculus in this country and in this world. And we saw some of that happen in Kentucky. Our campaign never endorsed anybody. But we went in some of those counties and brought together coal miners from the mountains and black folk from Louisville, and several counties turned in ways they had never turned when people found out that those that would divide us are afraid of the possibility of our unity. And so, as we began today, we want to know that we're building this power for an agenda that lifts all people by challenging the interlocking injustices of systemic poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, the war economy, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. And we are here today to ask you, Mayor Pete, questions as a presidential candidate. Some will come from me, and Jonathan, some from real folk right there. And we want you to see this video to see who we are. We want you to know that you're here at Greenleaf not because we are a black church or a white church, but because we are a justice-loving church in the center of a moral movement to bring us together to address systemic poverty and low wealth in this country, which, if we refuse to do it, America does it to its own demise. And so at this time, look at this video, Mayor Pete, and all of you from around the nation. And after the video, we invite you to take 5 minutes to tell us who you are, what you stand for, and introduce yourself to us, and then we will begin the process of questions coming from us and from people on the floor. Brother Mayor, bring the video up. We must be honest about the foundations of the political and economic systems we call America. I love America because of her potential, but I know that America will never even get close to being a more perfect nation until we are honest about the politics of rejection.
I want to tell you about some of the leaders who are building the Poor People's Campaign.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am a working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
I'm a second-generation fast food worker, and I've experienced the cycle of poverty firsthand. Growing up, I watched my mother endure long hours of back-breaking labor, doing everything she could to feed me and my sisters. My employer barely pays me enough to pay rent and utilities, let alone with the medical expenses with my mother.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
I'm a Vietnam veteran. My only chance of going to college was joining the Army.
It was one thing to know that you didn't have water and you couldn't afford your water. It's a whole nother to find out that they shut off your entire community and none of you matter.
But when I lost my housing, health care, and income all at the same time, I was terrified, panicked.
Hi, my name is Pamela Roach. I'm from Lowndes County, Alabama. And I live in a mobile home with my 2 kids. And I got raw sewage. I don't have no money on power. And I have to travel back and forth to Birmingham to take my daughter with the CPAP machine. Don't have a car and don't have no way to take her.
This is the largest encampment in Aberdeen. There's about 1,000 people in a town of 16,000 who are homeless.
In my community, we were all shut off for the day because none of us could afford our water bills. In the past, my family wasn't able to afford electricity in the winter. It was very hard on all of us.
But the indigenous people in the surrounding communities that are being affected, we talk about health care. We talk about worrying about the environment, but yet when they're allowing open pit mines and letting it leak into the land, into the water, the high rate of cancer and the high bills of health is going to continue to raise because of corporations and greeds and politicians that don't want to listen.
There's a new chemical company that's producing another carcinogen. In our community, it's amazing the people who just started dying of cancer. And when my wife was diagnosed with cancer, I was amazed at the black women that would ring our doorbell and walk in the door and pull a wig off to show my wife that I have it too.
This wall, this is sin of the highest order.
I put my life on the line at 17 years old to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And right now what we have domestic enemy right here.
When there are 38 million poor children, when 60% of African Americans are poor, when 65% of Latinx are poor, when 40% of Asians are poor, when there are 67 million poor white people, we must say, this is not right.
Somebody's hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.
Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the streets. For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong.
Our backs are against the wall, and we got no choice but to push.
We lift our voices for justice. We put our bodies on the line for mercy. And together we will proclaim liberty throughout the land for the enslaved, for the poor, and for us all.
Followed that breaking news in Albany, where a large group of protesters have moved into the street.
Washington Avenue between City Hall and Lark Street closed down.
Protesters with the Poor People's Campaign of Indiana.
2 o'clock on the East Coast, 2 o'clock in the middle, 2 o'clock on the West Coast. A wave, and the historians tell us it's never happened before.
Our communities, Muslim communities, who have joined the Poor People's Campaign, you can count on us.
Our democracy is in trouble.
Our democracy is in trouble.
And we come to demand.
And we come to demand.
Second warning.
I cannot stand here and claim to be a follower of Jesus Christ and be silent about the moral outrage that is going on in our country.
Because it's crucial that we make ourselves heard. No one is listening. We write letters, we make calls, no one is listening. So we gotta find a way to make ourselves heard.
We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we are here. We are poor. We are clergy. And we're here to say to our nation's capital and to the highest court of this land that everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to learn. Everybody has a right to love. Everybody has a right to living wages. Everybody has a right to vote. Everybody has a right to thrive in this society.
Everybody say, "Ah!" I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. Freedom fighter, and he taught us how to fight.
The poor and their clergy. We read Article 6 of the Kentucky State Constitution that says we have a right to free assembly.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
We demand the right to vote. The right to vote. We're formally
You need to cease and desist immediately or you'll be arrested.
There will be a movement that will break through the con and bring people together to save the heart and the soul of this democracy and this world. What do we want? What do we want?
And Pete, that's who we are. We're glad for you to be here to tell us who you are and why you're running for president. Welcome him again.
Thank you. Well, thank you, first of all, Bishop, for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for welcoming us earlier to worship with you. I'm an admirer of your ministry, of your work. I met your mother recently, so I ought to say I'm an admirer of your work, having met Mother Barber earlier today. And am so thankful for the opportunity for us to discuss issues of moral urgency that are at stake in this election. I believe that I am here to make myself useful, that I am part of this political process to make myself useful, but also that I was put on this earth in order to make myself useful to others. These are the values that I was taught by my parents. These are the values that I'm taught by my faith. And one of the reasons I was so electrified when I first heard you speak years ago in Philadelphia, cautioning against the voices that say, as I believe you said, so little about what God says so much and so much about what God says so little, is it made me take stock of what I hear about when I'm sitting in the pew on Sunday. And the scripture that says that when we think of the prisoner, we are supposed to imagine ourselves as though we are imprisoned with them. And the scripture that says we will be judged based on whether we welcome the stranger. And the scripture that says that whoever oppresses the poor taunts their maker. And trying to fit those moral teachings to the world we were living in. These are lessons that I learned in the streets of my own city as well, where I was trusted at the age of 29, 8 years ago, to take the leadership of the mayor's office in South Bend, a community that is low income, that is diverse, that was shrinking, that was hurting, that had been described as dying, and took steps together in a community that even after I had become mayor was still educating me every day about what was needed and what we could do together. And we invested in neighborhoods that hadn't seen investment in a long time. And we found places that were emptying out begin to fill up again. And we took steps to ensure that the health that was deteriorating, not so much because of what happened in the hospital or the doctor's office, but what was happening as a matter of environmental justice and other issues in homes, got addressed. And in these 8 years, often we have come up short, but often we have been able to advance together when our priorities were in the right place. Reducing poverty, improving health, and growing in a city that had been shrinking. And now I take that same experience into the presidential election process, where, frankly, people in politics are often specifically advised to speak of the middle class and not to use the word poor or poverty too much. I guess it's not considered to be as helpful politically to talk about that. But of course, there's no scripture telling us, as you've done to the middle class, so you have done to me. So if we think about the moral imperatives that are at stake right now in an election like this, we have to think about whether we are making ourselves useful to those who are most vulnerable and those who are most in need. And these problems did not begin with the present administration, although I would certainly argue that the present administration is not acting to improve them, but rather to make them worse. But it is important to remember that because I am running to be the president, by definition, who will take office the same day this administration comes to an end. And so the question before us is, then what? Where will we be and what will it take? And where we are now is that nearly half of the country is in poverty, that one job is not enough, that too many lack access to housing, to health care, to decent education, to the very basics of life, even as wealth concentrates itself. And it concentrates itself not only into greater and greater wealth, but into power. which is why so much depends not only on those in office, but on everybody who cares about the decisions made in those big white buildings, understand the importance of political mobilization and voting rights. And knowing that voting rights have actually been weakened, not strengthened, since the Voting Rights Act. And knowing what we have got to do, both to respond to racial voter suppression and to respond to the ways in which doing right by those who are vulnerable of whatever race has been made harder by the fact that we do not have decisions at the ballot box that reflect the totality of the people.
Amen.
I'm picking up on subtle cues that it's probably time for me to stop my opening remarks and go to questions.
Well,
it's hopefully really, that gives you some sense of who I am and how I come at this.
Actually, the amen is like, so be it. So I'm certainly saying so be it to us having the narrative shift, because you don't have the conversation, you're never going to have the policies. I want to do some house cleaning and turn it over to Jonathan. We did this conversation, and some people were there, and people weren't doing a lot of clapping, and so the media said, well, they did not like the person. Let me say this again. We are in church. In church, sometimes you do something called discernment. And to discern, you have to listen. We know when to clap and when to do whatever, but we also want to hear today. We're listening for politics. This is serious business. This is not about a popularity contest. It's really about the kind of stateswoman or statesmanship we need in this moment. Second house cleaning I want to do is each person will take about a minute. Those are asked a question, and we take a couple of minutes, to answer them. There will be some follow-up. No tricks. We don't play trick. We don't do trick stuff. We leave that to other folk, but we don't do that. And because it doesn't help anything. We're straightforward. And then somebody, just to clear the house, because I know it's out there, we're here to talk about poverty. And so somebody sent me this question, what are you going to say to the mayor about being gay? I said, nothing. I said, that's not a Bible question. You don't see Jesus raising that. It's not a constitutional question. You don't get to, there's no constitutional provision. I just got on a plane and flew 4 hours from Arizona here. I didn't ask the pilot, was he gay? But I did ask him, could he fly the plane? My surgeon, I don't ask him if he's gay, I want to know, can he do the surgery? And right now, what we're looking at is, are there candidates who can have the political courage, wisdom, and to address the issue of poverty and the interlocking injustices? That's the question before us. And I said that before, I think before you, I don't know if you were here when I was talking about, no, you were here during the welcome, but we need to kill some of these false narratives. So my brother Jonathan, he might want to tell you where he's from. Jonathan is kind of a strange dude. And then he might want to answer questions.
What I want to say is that I think you've come to the right place to learn about what's needed to address poverty. I first came to this place when I was 16 years old and had just finished an internship with Strom Thurmond in the U.S. Senate. Because I was raised right here in North Carolina by white Baptist folk who taught me that, to love Jesus was to be a good Republican, and I was trying to do that. But I began to realize that some of those things you were talking about from the Bible is not what we were actually trying to do in politics. And I came to this place and met this church and this movement that really has been in this state throughout its history. And Reverend Barber taught that to me. So we really believe that to address poverty, we have to lean into this fusion history. And so we wanted to begin a conversation about poverty by introducing you to a woman we met in Kansas, a farmer's wife in Kansas. And you can cue that video up. But just as a face of poverty, often poverty gets painted, as Reverend Barber said, as a black issue. What we've learned in studying and in being part of this movement is that the face of poverty in America is white women. There are more white women in poverty than anybody else. So let's hear from her, and then I want to introduce you to a couple that's here.
Now, I'm also a Kansas farmer's wife,
Kansas farmers are committing suicide at a far greater rate than the national average. Why? Because they're stressed out. They're stressed out. They're usually in debt up to their eyeballs because they can't pay for all the equipment that it takes to run a farm. And they're in the most dangerous line of work there is, yet many can't afford to buy health insurance. We have no hospital. We are in a food desert. We have one grocery store for the whole county. Our neighbor, my husband's uncle, still drinks pond water self-treated with chlorine. He had to have a kidney removed at age 64. And the year before that, his wife died of some unknown cancer.
So that's Mary Jane. Let me also introduce you to a couple in this church. If y'all just come on up right here on the stage so folks can see you as you asked your question. They wanted to ask a question about poverty. This is Lynn and Tony. We've got a microphone here. Good.
Hi, Mayor Pete. I'm originally from West Virginia. I'm a retired military, and I've seen no poverty. We can't act like poverty is a marginal issue that only impacts blacks and brown people. Over 140 million Americans are poor or low wealth. 4 million alone in North Carolina. That's 43% of our population. A third of America's poor here in the South. 20% of our voting population is poor and low wealth. We know that poverty disproportionately impacts the black, brown, LGBTQ communities. But in raw numbers, the majority of poor and low wealth people here and across America are straight white folks who've been fed lies about why they are poor. Given the moral crisis of poverty and low wealth in America, what would you do as president to make addressing poverty a reality?
First of all, I want to thank you for serving this country. And what you are discussing, I think, reflects how unified we ought to be in tackling an issue across all of the lines that we have been very skillfully divided across. Let me begin with something that is so simple that it might be blindingly obvious, and for that reason we may pass over it, but it is extremely important when discussing the issue of poverty, and it is this. People in this country need to get paid more. This is simple, straightforward, and it does not happen. You know, we talk about poverty, sure, there's complicated issues with globalization and automation and technology, but sometimes it's talked about like there's some cosmic force, a law of physics that has pushed us into the inequality we're in, when actually it's the consequence of specific policy choices that have been made. And one of those policy choices is that the federal minimum wage has been allowed to lapse, so that if you count for inflation, it is worth considerably less than it was when it was introduced. And you see it everywhere we go across the country. We were marching with McDonald's workers, trying to get $15, and a union. I'll come to the union part in a minute. But trying to get $15 an hour. Tawana Milligan, I remember her because I was trying to get a sense, actually I was trying to learn her story so that I could share it in the future, and wanted to get a sense of how her life would be different if she earned more than the 7-some an hour that she did. And I couldn't get her to talk about herself. She was talking about her son with special medical needs. She was talking about other people who depended on her. And it was a reminder that those who are fighting for more are also not fighting in a selfish way. They're fighting for the ability to provide for others, which often is where we get the most fulfillment, which is one of many, many reasons why it is a moral as well as an economic imperative to raise the federal minimum wage. Second, we need to make sure that everybody has access to the benefits you need to get by. This administration has cut SNAP, food aid, for those in poverty. Nobody is better off in a country where some are going hungry. On the contrary, the more people are hungry, the less they are able to work. For children, the less they are able to learn. They score poorly on a test. They do poorly on their grades. Maybe they're more likely to get into a fight and piped into the criminal justice system and are told all the way that it was their fault, but they were just hungry. So we have got to make sure that there is food. We need to make sure that workers are empowered to seek and demand more from the workplace. I've been reflecting a lot on manufacturing jobs because we think of them as good jobs. They pay well, they got good benefits. I'm from a part of the country that suffered from the loss of manufacturing jobs. The ones we have are still very important to us. But it was pointed out to me that those weren't always good jobs. They are good jobs now, but 100 years ago, they were considered dangerous, dirty, and undercompensated. They became good jobs because workers demanded that they become good jobs. And as I've been encountering fast food workers, service workers who are trying to organize home health care aides, of whom, by the way, we are going to need millions more in the years to come, if they have the opportunity to join a union, we know that they will be able to be better paid and to get better benefits. So increasing access to organized labor, both how you can unionize, including allowing multi-employer bargaining, and who can unionize. So if we're going to have more and more gig workers, for example, they're not considered employees.
That's right.
But they're working. They're doing a job. And to me, if you're doing a job, that makes you a worker. And if you're a worker, that means you ought to have benefits. And so I believe that gig workers should be treated as workers. So there's a whole lot we got to do to get people a better income. And then there's the side of cost, and making sure that the cost of education, the cost of healthcare, the cost of saving for retirement is more affordable. Otherwise, if the cost rises faster than income, then so many Americans will still find themselves effectively in poverty, even as their incomes rise. So these are some of the measures that we know we have to undertake that are subject to political decision making. By the way, in Washington, yes, but also in the states. One of the reasons why this movement has wisely targeted state capitals is that states are often restricting action in this direction. In South Bend, I was able to raise the minimum wage for employees of the city, but the state prevented us from doing it for anybody else living in the city. We were able to establish paid family leave for employees of the city, and I'm pretty sure it led to a bit of a baby boom on the fire department, but that was okay, we didn't mind. But the state prevents us from implementing that for any but our own employees, and so on. So this is a question of supporting the states doing the right thing and making sure states don't stand in the way of alleviating poverty, as well as making sure we have the right decisions in Washington.
Let me follow up. Tony and Lynn, let's thank them for coming up. Tony and Lynn, the Scalacci, thank you. And I think that they penetrate. Here Lynn says, you know, I'm from West Virginia and I've known poverty. And we also have to talk about workers, but we also at some point, many of the poor are disabled. Many of the poor are in areas where jobs have left.
Right.
Not so the people who desire to work, but have no jobs. You know, we wrestle with, do we leave them alone? Do we abandon them? Martin King talked about two Americas. And there might be three now, you know. He talked about the one where everything is honey and milk and corn, the other where there's struggle and abjectness, and then there might be another where, you know, people have just given up. Just given up. You know, I've been all over this country, was in Harlan County, Kentucky, where so many folk say they have not just given up, you know, but now they're joining this movement because they believe that in the agency, you know, of poor and low income people. And how important to you, and then I want to push on real quick, just a quick third, is it to you as a candidate to not just talk to people who talk about the poor, but actually go where poor and low income people are, whether it's in Appalachia or in Alabama, and really experience and see and hear them as they talk about the kinds of solutions that we need in this nation.
Yes, I believe that's so important, and we've taken opportunities, whether it's joining with fast food workers in the different cities that we visited, or a visit to a rural neighborhood in South Carolina to learn how people were living, or the conversations we have in my own community. We need to make sure that there's so much theorizing that happens about poverty. And I think when it's theorized, it leads to misunderstandings. For example, the idea that it's only about income. Of course it's about income, but there's a reason why the poverty of somebody who is afraid of what will happen if they have one disruption in life is different from For example, a student who comes from a stable family, who knows they have a job waiting for them, whose income might be the same as somebody living in poverty, but who doesn't have that fear and that vulnerability. So we need to make sure those voices are elevated and make sure those voices are heard.
Or military people who have to get food stamps.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we got, this is no play conversation. Not a county in this nation, there's not one county in this entire nation where if you make $725, you can afford a basic 2-bedroom apartment. And working in most counties, states, you have to work plus 80 hours a week, live at minimum wage.
Right.
Plus. I want to also turn to something, because we talk about interlocking injustices. And so we talk about racism, but we like to talk about policy racism, not cultural, because people often, the cultural racism and the words of racism are cover up for the policies. So you might find somebody that's a cultural racist, they got a lot of racist words, and somebody over here that never uses the word, but the policies they are passing are having a disparate impact on black and brown people and people of color. But when you look deeper, those same policies are actually hurting mostly white people. Because it is true that 61% of all African Americans are poor and low wealth, and that around 25 to 30% of whites are poor and low wealth. But the other is true, that's 26 to 30% of whites that are poor and low wealth. That's 66 million people. That's 61% of African Americans that are poor and low wealth. That's 26 million people. That means you have 40 million more in raw numbers. So the impact is different percentage-wise, but in raw numbers. And this is how we have to break this down. So I want to look at some maps and ask you a question. I want to show you some maps. As we do this, and Mayor Pete, we try to, in our movement, we don't say anything in Alabama we can't say in Iowa. We don't have 3 to 4 different messages. And we believe folk are ready for a grown-up conversation around how systemic racism is not just against people of color, but against America itself, right? So can you bring the maps up? All right, I want to show you something. Look at these. These are some maps we did. Now, not since 2016, but 2010. These are all the states. Now, a couple of them we didn't cover, like Alaska should be in there, and parts of California. But for talking's sake, these are all the states since 2010 that passed racialized voter suppression law. What the courts called in North Carolina surgical racism. Surgical racism. Look at all these states. Now, 26 of them. We decided that's normally a race issue. No, that's racism. But we said we want to dig a little bit further. So I asked our people that do maps, I can't do them, overlay that map. I said, show me the map of the states with the highest poverty. And we look, so wait a minute. The same states that have the highest racialized voter suppression, where people get elected through racialized voter suppression that undermines democracy, once they get power, they use that power in ways that passes policies that hurt the poor, not black poor folk. Because that's not the poverty rate of black people. That's the states with the highest poverty rates. Next map. Those darkest states, all of them are voter suppression states. And the same states that engage in racialized voter suppression also are the states that have the highest child poverty. Unaddressed, often ignored by the people in office, from the State House to the White House. Next one. Next map. This Women's Day in Greenland, same states. That if they are racist voter suppression state, they are also a high women in poverty state. Not black women, even though we could go through those numbers, but I want women. Next. Same states that block Medicaid expansion. And in North Carolina, there was a voter suppression state we fought for 6 years and won, but during that period, the people that got elected through racist voter suppression blocked Medicaid expansion. Of the 500,000 people that were denied, 346,000 were white, 150,000 were black. Percentage-wise, more black, numerical-wise, more white. Next map, last map. Same states, either without a living wage or no real minimum wage increases. Same states. Next one. Those who call themselves, now that's a whole nother debate, so we'll come back to that because I want to deal with that later. So take the maps off. So here's what we surmised, Mayor Pete, is that there is a causation, there, that if a state is a racist voter suppression state, and people are using that suppression to acquire power, then those that acquire power in that state also push policies or deny policies that could impact and change poverty, health care, and living wages. Now, the question is, so in light of this, you cannot address systemic poverty for everybody if you don't address systemic racialized racist voter suppression. As president, what would you do to address racist voter suppression and racist gerrymandering that is hurting the whole of our democracy?
So it is imperative to the future of the country that we address this. I often speak in the campaign about democracy, but not democracy as a system. Democracy is a value. The idea that we believe there is moral weight to the value of making sure that every voice is included, that every vote is counted, and that every voter counts. And there are a number of concrete things we could do right away. We could ensure automatic voter registration as soon as somebody's old enough to vote. We could make sure that the polls are open a reasonable amount of time. Unfortunately, some of these voter suppression tactics were pioneered in my state, like voter ID. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. But another thing in my state is that polls are open 6 to 6. Not everybody is able to vote between 6 and 6. We got to extend access to early voting. And we have to do something about this gerrymandering, because effectively what the gerrymandering does is it means that the politicians are choosing their voters rather than the voters choosing their politicians. And it often, more often than not, has a racial effect. And the consequence of this is that everybody is worse off. Those who suffer most are those who are on the harmed end of racial discrimination. But as you have pointed out, people of all races suffer in poverty, suffer from these policy decisions.
Yeah, let me do a follow-up, because what we're seeing is that oftentimes we are isolating and siloing the issues. So voting rights, we say that's a black issue.
Right.
When in fact, if you look carefully, voting rights better become all of our issues.
That's right.
It may be, and it is targeted at people of color. But why? To disempower the ability for black and white and brown people to form political coalitions that can change the political calculus.
That's right.
Especially in the South. The South is not red, really, or blue. It's more unorganized. And it's more divided by these tactics that are used, right, to hold on to power. Strom Thurmond and his crowds years ago said if they could use something called the white Southern strategy, and they could use these tactics, they could hold on to the South. And if they could hold on to about 13 Southern states, they end up controlling nearly 170 electoral votes. Just 13 states. So one of the things I'm going to ask you this question, Strom Thurmond filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1957 for one day, 24 hours.
Reading from the phone book.
Reading from the phone book. And we called him a racist. As we sit here today, McConnell, formerly Boehner, and Ryan, the current president, have engaged in interposition and nullification, use King's language, for over 2,000 days since the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And all these states no longer have pre-clearance. And it could have been fixed by the Congress. Strom Thurmond filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 57 for 1 day. And we said he engaged in racism. What are the people engaged in who have blocked fixing the Voting Rights Act for over 2,000 days, right? And who continue to do it despite all of the cases around the country where we're having to fight against racialized voter suppression. And what would you do as president on that issue of the restoration of the Voting Rights Act and pre-clearance? Since, as we sit here today, we have less voting rights sitting here today than we had in 1965 when the Voting Rights Act was first passed.
That's right. And these, I think the most charitable way to put it is that they are engaging in racial voter suppression. I think that's the most charitable way you could put it.
And the court
I could think of some other words.
That's right, that's right.
But we're in church, so I'm going to behave.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reality is we're going to need a 21st century Voting Rights Act that restores and advances what was laid out originally, but also looks at the new ways, the new technologies of suppression that are only going to get more sophisticated. That surgical, you can think of it as a kind of laser surgery that can now be done because of technology, means that we have to make sure our democratic defenses are stronger. On some level, I think what it's come down to is this. There are some who have concluded that the only way that their policies and their politicians will prevail is if not everybody gets to vote. To me, that's a pretty good sign that you got to change your policies and your politicians. But this is the rearguard action of an anti-majoritarian force that sees that there are more people who believe in this moral call to do right, especially by the most vulnerable among us, than not, but have figured out a way to disempower that coalition that could exist. And that calls out for action, beginning with the 21st Century Voting Rights Act.
You know, one of the things I had to learn in kind of becoming anti-racist, first that it mattered to me and my people, right? But also that our people had been sold a bill of goods in this narrative that really began as resistance to the desegregation of public schools after Brown. And so I want to invite one of this state's longtime anti-racism crusaders up. Nelson Johnson is here with us, and he's here with his grandson to ask a question about public education and what it means to, are you here, Brother Nelson? I'm looking for him. Please, come on up. All right. How we take this, you know, anti-racism that you're talking about in terms of voting rights and apply it to public education.
And why
that
matters with poverty.
For poverty,
And if you're going to deal with poverty, we have to deal with access to public education, not just for black people, but for all people. But he's going to question his own way with his grandson.
My name is Nelson Johnson, 4 years Air Force, retired pastor, and now co-director of the Beloved Community Center. I'm partnering with my grandson today. I'd like to invite him to introduce himself.
Bring that mic down to him real good.
My name is Nelson Josiah Samari Johnson. I am 10 years old in 5th grade, attending school at The Point, located in High Point, North Carolina, and I am very glad to be here.
We're glad you're here.
All right. Thank you for coming.
So our question is, we know access to high-quality public education is essential to addressing inequality in this country. But our public schools are being undermined by underfunding and resegregation. If you get to appoint the next Secretary of Education, what will be the education priorities of your administration? What will be the education priorities of your administration?
Well, thank you both for joining us and for speaking out. Very first consideration for a Secretary of Education is that they believe in public education. because I don't think we have that right now.
Thank you.
Second is that they believe in equity in public education. Third is that they would be willing to commit resources with the backing of the president, of course, who will be willing to go to Congress and go to bat for this to make sure that everybody has access to quality public education. Whether you thrive should not come down to whether you were fortunate enough to win an admissions lottery to one of a handful of schools. By the way, this is important not only for the clear and glaring reason that we need to make sure that we educate everybody well and give them that chance to thrive, but also because right now we are starting to see many communities where the polarization and stratification is happening in our schools. In other words, if public school is only considered to be there for people who don't have access to something else, then it becomes one less thing we all have in common as a country at a time when we desperately need to have more things in common as a country. And so for all of these reasons and more, we've got to act. Now, in most countries, if you have an area where there's more poverty or more need, you can expect that more dollars would go into educating the students in that area. We are one of the few places where often the reverse is true, partly because of the reliance on property taxes in many places and other problems with the way we fund our schools. So it's why I would begin by routing a massive increase in federal dollars through Title I that sends those dollars to the schools where they are needed most. Another thing is that we need to lift up the teaching profession, and that includes compensating the teaching profession properly.
Amen. Amen.
You know, I would, alongside those service members you mentioned, I'm afraid there may be a fair number of educators who might find themselves reliant on public assistance because of the wages.
You saw one on the film.
That's right.
From West Virginia.
Yeah.
She said, I'm a teacher with a 4-year degree and I'm a working poor.
And we're talking about public servants, people who we rely, if we did a better job of honoring our teachers a little more like soldiers and paying them a little more like doctors, this country would be a better place for everybody, especially for those who seek opportunity.
Let me follow up. Thank you. And so one of the pieces on that, again, we don't isolate conversations. So for instance, the Brennan Center has talked about 2 major attacks on education is high poverty and resegregation. A school that's high poverty, whether it's predominantly white or black, underfunding, you know, it's amazing how people fund everything else, but when it comes to school, they don't need it. You know, we have not kept pace as we should. You know, there are forces that do not really want to see public education thrive, and it grows out of desegregation. My mother, who sits there, was helped to desegregate her high school. And now the high schools and some of these, in this city you're in, the schools in this city, we have a military base in this city. And yet the schools in this city are totally resegregated. And the students on the base are bused out of the city so that the schools in the city no longer get the military money that they used to get when the schools were segregated. So resegregation is happening faster in America, but we have to understand resegregation is not just about black and folks sitting beside each other. It never was. People knew that if you can segregate the students, you can segregate the dollars. You can segregate the curriculums. You can segregate teacher access. And so in that piece, and our white brothers and sisters need to understand that addressing, if you're going to address poverty, you got to address poor schools and resegregate schools that impact everybody. And again, resegregation of our public schools, you don't just want to change that because you're altruistic. You want to change it because the same forces that will resegregate schools will defund set schools. See, right. That's what we're trying to say, why it's a moral issue.
That's right. Yeah.
What do you think about addressing the issue of resegregation from that standpoint? Not just we got to sit beside each other, but understanding that that allows a kind of segregating of resources.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is part of what I was getting at when I mentioned that we have this need for shared things, too, because when you have a shared experience of quality public education, then you have a shared support base, political base, to ensure that educational resources get to everybody who needs them. And we see these patterns. I have to confess that I was slow to realize. I worked for years under the illusion that our schools in my city were integrated, because they had to be, because of a court order. But what I slowly realized was that while that was true within the limits of the South Bend Community School District as they were drawn, if you looked at the county, almost all of the diversity of our youth was in a single school district, which is ours. And it's one of many examples of how you just have to peel back the surface, and then you see the persistence or the return of different forms of segregation. All the more reason why we need to back public education and back a diverse group of educational professionals. Teachers need to come from every background. So, because that's segregated too, in many ways.
That's right. We have a question from our brothers and sisters, and rise up and fight for 15. Right. They'll come at this time. You need the water or anything, man? You're
all right, thank you.
These are the folks you were marching with where? Where did you
That's
march?
right, yeah. We were in Charleston.
Charleston.
And we were in LA.
See, Raise Up is North Carolina's Fight for 15.
Very good.
Hi, my name is Earl Bradley. Poor People Campaign moral budget shows that a $15 federal minimum wage intact immediately would raise pay for 49 million workers by the combining $328 billion per year. These pay raises would dwarf the $7.1 billion in tax cuts bonus employer gives U.S. workers in 2018. If elected, what is your plan to guarantee living wages and union rights to American workers?
Thank you, my brother. Stand right there.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you. And thank you for organizing on this issue. Again, first of all, I support the legislation that, by the way, passed in the U.S. House to implement a $15 minimum wage, but is one of many pieces of good legislation that has gone to the Senate and died there. Now, one of the things I think we need to remember as a matter of strategy is that most of the American people believe in raising the federal minimum wage. You wouldn't know it by the way they talk about the politics around it, but most Americans, including in conservative states, believe this is the right thing to do, which is why I am convinced that even if the Senate were to remain in the hands of the current party in charge there, if you have the House continuing to pass this legislation and a president willing to fly into the home states of anybody standing in the way of a higher federal minimum wage, we will be able to get it passed. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as you said, union representation is important too. And it is important not only to make sure that wages are strong, but because we see a much lower level of things like workplace harassment and discrimination in employees that are protected by a union. It goes to that interconnection of all of these issues we were talking about. Workplace harassment, in turn, is one of the many reasons why we have a wage gap in this country for women, and in particular for women of color. Matter of fact, if we just stayed with business as usual, the amount of time that it would take for the wage gap to close to where all women, including women of color, were making the same as men in this country would be 200 years, which is unacceptable. But one of the reasons is that if people experience harassment in the workplace, they're more likely to drop out or to take an even lower paying job because of the need to have something but being unable to stay where they were. Right. So it's just one of many, many examples why we need those union protections. I am proposing that we aim to double the level of union membership in this country. Wow. And we will be better off when we do. As I said earlier, that means new categories of people who can organize, like Uber drivers. I also believe that it means that we got to look at just how we make it possible to organize. I'll give you an example. If somebody works at a fast food restaurant, you're at an Arby's, and there's a Burger King across the street, employees at those two workplaces should have the opportunity to try to team up and bargain. So we need to look at multi-employer bargaining because that's part of what would empower workers. Now, this is going to require a lot of changes to law, especially because we have these so-called right-to-work laws, or as I think of them, right-to-work-for-less laws that block the formation of unions. But we can act on that at the federal level, and when we do, it will be easier to organize and to be paid better.
That's right.
And again, I want to congratulate you for standing up for this, because this won't happen without workers standing up, but I promise that in me, you will have a president who will stand with you.
And that's so critical. You know, 62 million people who work for less than a living wage. And as the brother just said, if we did it immediately, and that's one of the things we're pushing candidates on. A lot of folks say, I'm for living wage, but they're for it 15 years from now. And it'll be 15 years from now, it'll be not doing nothing.
Right.
It needs to be immediate. But if we do it immediate, you pump more money into the pockets of people, into the economy, than were put in their pockets by these so-called little tax things that Trump did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But another way we say it, Mayor, is, you know, for African Americans particularly, you know, it took us 400 years to get from 0 to 725. We can't wait another 400. You know, but it also is important to say this isn't about a handout. You know, what would it do to America, for America, if we immediately had a federal law, you know, because all of these southern states are right to work.
Right.
And we're starting, and a lot of our brothers and sisters, white and black, are beginning to see that that is by design to keep poor whites and working class whites separated. And the right to work law, for instance, in North Carolina, today is the anniversary of Rosa Parks sitting down. The law in North Carolina that said public service workers could not organize, public service workers, was put into place right after the Montgomery bus boycott and the fear of black and white folk joining together in the South. Yeah. So are you an immediate or taking 400 more years? But then they know what,
I say we got to act fast. I respect that there's a transition that had, especially for small businesses, to be able to catch up, but we got to make it as fast as possible. And I think the House bill was more than reasonable enough.
Well, how about this? How about as fast as we bailed out them corporational crooks?
There you go.
How about, okay, if we're not immediate, we did that pretty fast, you know, and they were their own fault. You know, they stole money and got our money for free.
Right.
And we said they were too big to fail.
Right.
Well, what about a president that says workers are too precious not to make a living wage?
Very good.
And we start treating people like people rather than treating corporations like people and people like things.
That's right.
Yeah, thank you.
One of the things that we're learning in this campaign as we travel is that making more is a huge issue in terms of addressing poverty. But also, for many people, even who have good jobs, lack of access to health care is just ruinous, and that's real. There are some folks here today who are going to come, and as they're coming to ask a question about health care, we wanted you to meet by video a woman named Callie Greer, who we met in Alabama, to share her story.
Callie Greer from Selma, Alabama, who had to bury her daughter, Venus, because she didn't have health care.
I'm here today to share my daughter's Venus's story. Venus discovered a small lump in her breast and she wasn't insured. Venus had to be approved for every prescription and every piece of medical equipment that she needed. I'm standing here today in solidarity with the Poor People's Campaign because no one should have to bury their child in America because they don't have health care insurance.
Callie Greer. I had to bury my son, Michael. He was born on my birthday in 1974 and died 32 years, 5 months, 128 days later. That's him. I can't get him back. And 500,000 Americans have died the same way since he died. So I have a question for you. North Carolina is a state where the legislature refused to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. So 500,000 people who would have access to health care in this state do not. 350,000 of those people are white. More than 100,000 are black. 40,000 of them have served in the military, and about 3 of them die every day. But even if we had Medicaid expansion tomorrow, there are still hundreds of thousands of North Carolinians who would be uninsured. This is true across the nation, where politicians are guaranteed free health care for life just because we elect them to serve. Often when we talk about access to health care for every American, we debate how much it will cost. But we know what it costs America not to insure all of us. Our moral budget has found the money to pay for the health care we need. What is your plan to guarantee access to health care for everyone in this country as soon as possible?
I want those other persons to quickly introduce themselves as well and tell why you're standing there with Leslie.
I'm Yvette Gabbery, and I am a community Latino leader in Alamance County here in North Carolina, for People's Campaign as well. I myself have been, unfortunately, a victim of not having health care and having health issues kind of get expedited because of that fact. Currently caring for a grandchild with special needs as well.
My name is Rebecca Barber. At 2 years old, I was diagnosed with a pre-existing brain condition. So I've experienced firsthand, I've had access to health care, and I know firsthand what can happen when, the system works and when a person has access, but I know that many do not have access. And that is why I'm an advocate for health care. I have many friends living without health insurance, people that are my age. So, this is a very pressing issue.
And our question, as I want everybody to hear it, because we're pushing candidates now. How do you talk about this issue without starting with the question, how much does it cost, as opposed to the real question, how much does it cost for us not to do it?
Well, the cost of inaction is unbearable. And I'm so sorry, Leslie, to hear your story and of your loss. No one should bury their child, least of all in America because of a lack of access to health care. That simply should not be possible in the United States of America. And part of it, you're right, is the failure to expand Medicaid, and that should not have happened. And for anybody to talk of morality when we are called to heal the sick, and politicians have blocked Medicaid expansion, is unconscionable. But we got to do more. So my plan is to make sure everybody is insured. There's no such thing as an uninsured person in America. The way I would do it, we call it Medicare for all who want it. But let me add another detail once I'm done explaining it that maybe hasn't come across yet in the press. So what it means is that everybody can get access to a Medicare-like plan. And that for those who cannot afford premiums, the subsidies are there so that cost is never a barrier. And if people would rather have some other kind of plan, that's okay. I don't mind them being able to buy that. But everybody has access to this public plan. The one thing I want to mention is that if somebody falls between the cracks and they go to get care and they don't have coverage at all, we would retroactively enroll them in that public plan so that there's truly no such thing as not having medical insurance in this country. Because it's hard enough. We're coming up on a year since I lost my father. And as tough as that situation was, he was eligible for Medicare. And so the only decisions we had to make, tough ones, but they were not financial decisions. They were medical decisions about what was right for our family. I want every American to have that same opportunity. Now let's talk about cost, because people always ask me, what's your plan going to cost? And we can pay for the whole thing. It's not cheap. It's $1.5 trillion over 10 years. But compared to the cost of business as usual, I think it's a bargain. And all we have to do is two things. One thing is we have to allow Medicare to negotiate the cost of drug prices with drug companies, which I think is common sense. And the other, which is how we get the bulk of the funds, is to roll back the corporate tax rate cut that was in the Trump tax cuts. Because frankly, I think they're doing just fine, and I don't think they needed that tax cut to begin with. All you got to do is do that, and we can deliver that healthcare vision that I'm talking about.
Thank you. Mayor Pete, our campaign would also like to share that when our economists, some of the best in the world, looked at this, we also found that if you just cut if you took one contract or one military contract company, we still have the most powerful over and over, you could fund all of the states that denied Medicaid expansion without raising any taxes. That's one of the reasons why we're pushing, and we're also pushing politicians, and we will hope that you would speak to this in the days to come, to talk about the value of an investment. You know, every time is how much does it cost? What is an investment? If you invest in healthcare, what does that do to the economy? What does that do to keep people at work? What does that do in terms of saving? We must start talking about what is it costing us not to do this? And I get that question from a Nobel Peace Prize economist, Joseph Stiglitz, in his book where he talks about the cost of poverty. Not what does it cost to fix us, but what is the cost of not doing anything? And we have to get that into the public discourse.
That's right.
Let me raise now, Jonathan,
How about where you were this week?
Yeah, with the experience, we want to talk a little bit about the issue of, we appreciate your stance on the climate and on ecological, dealing with ecological devastation. I was in Oak Flats, where a multinational company, because of a rider put on a defense bill by a senator from Arizona, is threatening to take their religious lands, their Mount Sinai, their Jerusalem, from them, ignore the religious significance, drill down into the earth for 2% copper. That's all, of the 100% of what they bring, only 2% is usable, and the other will poison the aquifers to the surrounding towns and poison the land and destroy. And Apache Chief Winsler, former Chairman Winsler, Nosey, is risking his life right now. He just today took residents up, left the reservation. He said he's no longer going to be awarded the state to go camp out and defend, non-violently, but defend those sacred lands. But all over this country, 4 million people that get up every day who can buy unleaded gas and can't buy unleaded water. 14 million people that can't afford water, black and white. The case in Oak Flats is another form of policy racism. We don't talk about it. There's no big news cameras like it was at Charlottesville. It should be, because that's a form of racism, right? We have somebody who wants to ask a question on this issue of ecological devastation, and they will introduce themselves and raise their question.
Hello, Mayor Pete. Thank you for being here. My name is William Barber III. I serve as the Ecological Justice Co-Chair for the North Carolina Poor People's Campaign, and in my professional work, also do work around the climate crisis.
Hello, my name is Crystal Cavalier Keck. I am Okinichi Band of the Saponi Nation. I'm a citizen. I live in Alamance County. I'm also the president of the Native American Caucus for the state. This is my husband, Jason, behind me.
So our campaign has seen across this country how whenever communities experience the effects of climate change, from fires to floods to drought, the poor suffer first and worst. We also see corporations and corrupt politicians in collusion steal land to drill for minerals, build pipelines, or dump coal ash in ways that poison our water, air, and land.
This is our question to you. Since you can't address poverty without addressing ecological devastation and climate change, please tell us how your plan to address these issues is good news to the poor.
Well, thank you for that, and thank you also for shining a light on what is going on in Arizona, because I think it also calls us to remember that the relationship with tribes in this country is a relationship between sovereign nations. And tribal sovereignty will be respected in my presidency.
Yes.
I promise that. And it is often those most vulnerable, Native families, African American families, poor families of every race who have the most to lose. And frankly, globally, it's poor countries that have the most to lose from the effects of ecological devastation and from climate change, which is why we must act. It is another example of where the only way it looks expensive is if we fail to account for the cost of doing what we're doing. Because it would show up pretty quickly, if you accounted for it properly, that acting now is a bargain relative to cleaning up the harm that will be done. Just economically, let alone morally, the harm that is being done. So what can we do about it? I believe that this is one of those moments when America must adopt a national project, that we have to make it something that all of us are part of to end climate change and end our dependency on fossil fuels. It starts with things we could do very quickly. By 2025, we could double the amount of clean energy on our grid. Some things will take longer, but step by step, by 2050, which is about as long as we can possibly do this, by 2050, be a carbon neutral economy across the United States. We've got to. And in order to do that, it's going to take everything that any of us can bring. Not only the development of wind and solar, but also the development of carbon neutral or carbon negative farming. Farming could actually be a huge part of the solution. And in putting out that call, I'm also recruiting a part of America that maybe has only ever heard that they're part of the problem and asking them, and by the way, funding them, to be part of the solution. We need to make sure that federal purchasing invest in things like biofuels. We've got to do this across every sector of American life. And the reason why I feel a great deal of hope, the reason I think there is good news in this, as bleak as the current situation and the business as usual scenario are, is that we kind of need a national project. I think our country will stand taller when we have a national effort like that. And for once, there's a national project available to us that's not about fighting other people. It's about leading the world and getting something done. And this has to be global. We have to lead the nations of the world because we can't do it alone. But we know the world can't do it without American leadership. So at home, that means massively increasing investment in renewable energy, energy storage, carbon storage, with an equity focus on those who are harmed most, and making sure that funding is directed at areas that are already seeing the impacts. But also globally, leading the way and making sure that this is a cornerstone of our diplomacy as we go out around the world. If we fail to act now, we will continue to see the most vulnerable made worse off. And we saw it in our own city, where almost inevitably, when we saw huge floods that came to our city, once in a lifetime floods, only we had them twice in 2 years. So something's up. And sure enough, it was often the homes of, in the lowest income areas of town that were most likely to be destroyed and where people had nowhere to go.
Do you have any follow-up to that? Do you all?
I think, I think, when we talk about the frontline communities, the most vulnerable communities, there's a lot of attention placed on the impact that they will face. And we really highlight the need to make them a part of the equation in terms of our response. But pushing slightly, when we talk about this massive energy transition, a just transition, what does it look like to truly include those communities in the conversation as we build this new future?
Well, the good news is there's a lot of opportunity here. In fact, our estimates are that 3 million net new jobs will be created under the climate plan I'm putting forward. But we need to do that with intention. And there should be a focus, for example, when we're offering training, whether it's in new jobs that might sound a little newfangled, involved with working with new sources of power, or jobs that are actually very easy to understand today, like union insulator and electrical worker jobs. One way or the other, we need to make sure that those opportunities are extended first to those with the most to lose. That means communities that have been on the receiving end of environmental injustice, communities that are vulnerable to climate change harms, and communities that for other reasons have been subject to the consequences of poverty and systemic discrimination in this country. And our plan contemplates that as we work with local cities, towns, and counties in order to create action plans that have equity as a central consideration. Because the reality is, even if we hit all of our targets, as we're going to have to find a way to do, we know that these impacts are already on us. All the more reason why, in the name of justice, we need to make sure that we are lifting up those who have been harmed the most and making them first in line for the opportunities that are going to be created by getting this right.
You know, I think the reason that follow-up, thank you all, that follow-up is so important is that too often the same people that mess up something end up getting paid to clean it up. So for instance, you saw the film about Louisiana and Cancer Alley. You know Cancer Alley was plantation? The worst plantations, the plantations that were so bad when black folk revolted, they cut the heads off of the revolters and put them on sticks down the Mississippi. Then when they could no longer do slaves, they turned them into sharecropping. Then when they couldn't do sharecropping, they leased the land, didn't sell it, to polluters. To polluters. So the same people that owned the land for slaves and sharecropping, then leased the land to the polluters, got federal money to create that Cancer Alley, and now it's destroying people's lives, black and white. And now they want more money to clean up. So I think the point is we cannot have the same corporations that mess up the community and dump the coal ash and build the pipelines that undermine the community, and then when we decide to have a national project to spend money, they find a way to get that money. Right. They need to be written out, and the people need to be written in.
Very good.
And lastly, I want to ask you this. Do you see addressing voter suppression and gerrymandering as a part of that national project? Because I don't see how we're going to get the political power to address these things legislatively if we write off the South and continue to leave the South in other areas victim to racial voter suppression that allows people to get in office who are adversely against dealing with the issues of ecological destruction.
Absolutely right. I think one of the problems we have as a country is that the issues of systemic racism generally and racial voter suppression specifically are talked about as though they only impact people of color, as though they only impact those who are being suppressed. And while there is no question that the worst harms are against those who are directly discriminated against, the entire country, and in this case, the entire world, are made worse off because we do not make decisions as a country that incorporate the will of everybody who is impacted. And there was a time when it was assumed almost that rural areas and workers would stand shoulder to shoulder in order to lift up those who were oppressed. The division of people of mutual interests, often along lines of race, harms everybody. And to me, democracy is the issue of how we deal with every other issue. Whether we're talking about Citizens United and the role of money in politics, or the gerrymandering that we were discussing, or all of the different forms of voter suppression that have been created. For my dime, I actually consider the Electoral College itself to be an example of this problem, because it affected anybody who had to live under a presidency that came about because the American people were overruled, and we're living under one right now, which means everybody is experiencing the consequences of that distortion in our democracy.
Well, we have two more. I think we're going to do two more questions. I got to do this, and I know we got to get out, but this is, because I can't figure this out. And maybe you're from Indiana, I was from Indiana, you may know this.
We'll still claim you.
Okay, okay. So why is it, if we have, even in the current, all this bad policy coming about with so many people that benefited from racialized voter suppression, and we have all this conversation and we're still trying to figure out what Russia did, and we should. But we are having a conversation about what voter suppression did, and we know what it did. Now, we're still kind of guessing around what Russia did. You know, how will you help change the conversation so that we don't get caught up in a nation sometimes in not facing the obvious. You know, it's obvious. For instance, the current president wins by 30,000 votes in Wisconsin, 250,000 votes were racially suppressed, voter suppressed. In this state, we have a senator who won by 30,000 votes. We know 100,000 votes were suppressed, and he was the architect of voter suppression in this state, right? And what is it? You know, can I just be real? Why Democrats so scared to deal with the issue and to help folk understand white folk and that people are playing us against each other? And because of that, we're all getting sold a bill of goods and prevented from coming together. You may not even want to answer. Maybe you'll answer it in your next speech. Maybe you'll do a big speech on systemic racism and poverty and how it all connects. But I just thought, put that on your mind. Yeah. Jonathan.
So you mentioned our need for a national project. I think that sense of need is felt widespread. Unfortunately, the current administration has proposed a wall as the national project, which thankfully isn't being built very much. But the consequence has been the demonization and the targeting of whole communities of people. Certainly, brown immigrants have been targeted. When I go home today, I'm going to stop by the church where I minister in Durham, and we've been a sanctuary church for 2.5 years because a fellow named Jose Chicas, who's lived here since the mid-'80s, got a deportation order from this administration. You know, he registered with ICE under the Bush administration. They knew where he was during the Obama administration. First appointment of this administration, he faced a deportation order. So I've been very present to that context of family separation, but we know a lot about family separation at the border. There are thousands and thousands of families that have been separated. What's your plan to immediately address this crisis that's been created for the immigrant community by the current administration?
So what's happened is a crisis has been created, a humanitarian crisis has been created by the choices this administration is making. And we saw it in our community too. I saw the whole west side of our city, a part of the west side, basically shut down just over the rumor of an ICE raid. I saw someone very similar to the person you're describing, a guy who had lived in our area for about 20 years and registered, went in every year with ICE, did as he was trying to get his green card sorted out. And this first year of this administration, when he went in, he didn't come back out. Business owner, parent, and I found myself meeting with all of his friends and supporters. By the way, all of them conservative Republicans, white conservative Republicans who lived in that area, who were furious because they didn't think that deportation was going to happen to Roberto. They loved Roberto. He's a good guy. And found myself looking into the eyes of his 8-year-old son, trying to think of something to tell him that would be true, because I couldn't say, it's okay, you're going to get your dad back. In the end, the whole family decided they had to move to Mexico, even though the kids had only ever known our part of Indiana as home. And this does not make America safer. On the contrary, the climate of fear makes us all worse off. I'll give you a simple example. If the administration succeeds in pressuring local law enforcement to do immigration work for them, as they have pressured us, and we have resisted, then a lot of people are going to hesitate to speak to law enforcement at all. One of the things we did was we created a local ID card just to say that you can be a card-carrying resident of the city of South Bend. And I use the word resident because for my purposes, as far as whether we're going to come to your house when you call 911 or whether we're going to pave the road for you in the city, it doesn't matter what your citizenship status is. You're a resident, you're part of this community. And so we created that card so that if you're interacting with law enforcement, or for that matter, just trying to get through life, pick up a prescription or something, you had a way to do it. You can't vote with it, you can't drive with it, you can't fly with it, but you could at least get through life. So we need to build up that sense of belonging nationally too. What does that actually look like? Well, first of all, the laws themselves need to change. There's this whole debate over the enforcement of the laws because there are horrific enforcement practices like family separation that need to end on day one. For-profit detention centers for children, by the way, is a category of thing that should not even exist. Right. and will end. But you see, the enforcement priorities will always be out of kilter if the law doesn't make sense. And you look at the arbitrary caps on how many folks can come from which countries, which aren't connected to any reality right now. You look at the bureaucracy. You look at the lack of a pathway to citizenship for the 11 million undocumented folks who are here. We need that, especially for dreamers. We fixed the law. Then, in addition to the overall growth of the country being supported, it becomes simpler to manage our border in a way that matches our laws and our values at the same time.
Quick follow-up on law and enforcement, because as we talk to folks who are being impacted by this issue across the country, in the same rooms, often folks from poor and black communities will say, we know something about over-enforcement of laws in our community. Mass detention and mass incarceration, are not just about this administration, but I think they're certainly deeply connected. What's your proposal to address mass incarceration?
Well, if incarceration made a country safe, we'd be the safest country in the world because we're the most incarcerated. And we most certainly are not the safest country in the world. Mass incarceration must end. It's that simple. So I'm proposing that we cut it by half. Now, that's going to take a level of action with the states that has to happen across the country, but the federal government can drive it. And we can do it by changing sentencing. For example, sentencing on drug possession, where it's clear that the incarceration is doing more harm than the original offense. We've seen a lot of that in our community. It means making sure, in fact, I would say that incarceration should never be a response simply to possession, because we know that criminalizing addiction doesn't work. That's part of it. Using the clemency powers of the presidency in the best way is part of it. Making sure that we change sentencing guidelines is part of it. Again, from a power and economic perspective, we're also always going to have a pressure toward more incarceration as long as some folks are making a profit off of incarceration, which is why there should not be for-profit private prisons in this country. We'll just be better off when we don't have them.
And because we're going to wrap up some, but also investment again. It's been proven that the dollar investment on the front end of the life saves you tens of dollars on the back end of life. So to actually be investing and pushing more in incarceration and in education than investing in, instead of building prisons, build jobs, bring corporations, create investment zones. Right. That is so problematic if we're serious about addressing the issue of poverty. And one other piece that you mentioned, let me ask you a quick rapid fire. Do you think we need to also stop allowing forces to demonize, quote unquote, people who are trying to get their immigration status, and we start lifting up all the ways they benefit this country, the money in Social Security, the taxes they pay, the jobs they create? Somewhere, don't we need to say, wait a minute, so yes, and I'm just going to do some rapid fire.
Yeah, I mean, the uncomfortable reality is that undocumented folks are, in many ways, like Social Security, subsidizing everybody else.
And we need to talk about that. And shouldn't we have some conversation whenever people say we call people illegal aliens and all these things that are not human and certainly not Christian? Why can't we just own in America that some of the people that are trying to come from Mexico here are coming back to land we stole? And the reason we took the land is because people wanted to keep their slaves. I mean, we have to have some historical clarity around these issues. Abraham Lincoln was against the Mexican-American War. Abraham Lincoln was against that war that ended up snatching territory from Mexico over the issue of slavery. So one of the things, and I know in this sound bite, you don't get this when you go on, it's sound bite, but do you think some of our candidates, you maybe, need to have some specific, and others, some specific speeches where you help educate this country on the lies we've been told that keep us so divided? You know, so I see your head shaking. We got two quick questions. I got to go because of their plan. We're going to do one that you have, the 53-cent piece, and then we're going to play a clip from Dr. King, and we got a question from two clergy, and we'll be out. Okay.
So this campaign names as one of the interlocking issues, the war economy. And we know from our research that 53% of every discretionary dollar goes to the military. You're a veteran. We're in a military town. We certainly honor the role of the military. But what do you think we can cut from the military in order to pay for some of these things we need?
So I think we need to reassess our entire set of priorities when it comes to especially military spending, because we're still, I think, behaving in a 20th century mentality. We have 21st century threats like cybersecurity issues and global climate change, which is a 21st century threat. And yet the administration has a 17th century security technology in mind when they're talking about a moat full of alligators or a big wall, right? So it's very clear that we need to reprioritize everything. And in particular, I think we need to scrutinize the way that contracts are done, especially cost plus contracts. I mean, where we don't even, we just say, you know, take whatever you think you need and then we'll add some to it. It does not exactly create fiscal discipline. And we need to look at where we are projecting force around the world. There won't be an easy solution. It can't be as simple as kind of across the board slash this or slash that. But I do believe that we will find major savings when we actually fit our security spending to our security needs.
You know, we've got a lot of veterans in the Poor People's Campaign, a lot of military folk. And they tell us a nation can't survive when you have 53 cents of every discretionary dollar going toward the war economy and 13 or 14 cents going to infrastructure and healthcare and education. We are maybe defending ourselves, over-defending ourselves one place and under-defending ourselves in the other, remembering that Rome fell not because of what was happening on the battlefield, but what happened inside of Rome. We also know there's a travesty that we have combat soldiers that many times don't even make a living wage, and yet military contractors that make millions of dollars. Do we have to look at those inequities as a nation?
I think we have to. And while we're at it, why is it that we've not been able to properly fund taking care of those veterans who did serve in uniform? Exactly. And taking care of their mental as well as physical health. So it's a question of priorities.
And for the media, I say that my father was a Navy man. You know, I was approached one night, I can't say who the general was, on a plane, and he said, keep doing the work you're doing. We need folk, because Eisenhower, a Republican, warned us of the military-industrial complex. A Republican said that, a military-industrial complex, what it could do to damage the society if it was not held in check. Well, lastly,
you're here in church with a couple preachers. We've got a couple more preachers we want to call for a final question about the moral narrative that this campaign is trying to challenge.
Play the clip.
As they come, we'll hear a clip from Dr. King, and then please.
He said this 65.
It may be said of the slavery era that the white man took the world and gave the Negro Jesus, then it may be said of the Reconstruction era that the Southern aristocracy took the world and gave the poor white man Jim Crow. Yes, sir. He gave him Jim Crow, and when his wrinkled stomach cried out for the food that his empty pockets could not provide, he ate Jim Crow, a psychological bird that told him that no matter how bad off he was, at least he was a white man better than the black man. And he ate Jim Crow. And when his undernourished children cried out for the necessities that his low wages could not provide, he showed them the Jim Crow signs on the buses and in the stores, on the streets and in the public buildings. And his children, too, learned to feed upon Jim Crow, that last outpost of psychological oblivion. Thus the threat of the free exercise of the ballot by
the Negro and white masses alike resulted in the establishment of a segregated society. They segregated Southern money from the poor whites. They segregated Southern mores from the rich whites. Yes, sir. They segregated Southern churches from Christianity. Yes, sir. They segregated Southern minds from honest thinking. Yes, sir. And they segregated the Negro from everything. Yes, sir. That's what happened when the Negro and white masses of the South threatened to unite and build a great society.
Hello, Mayor Pete. I am Reverend Hannah Broom. I'm a minister in the AME Zion Church, presiding elder, and I'm also the faith chair of the Poor People's Campaign.
I'm Reverend Vance Haywood from St. John's MCC in Raleigh, and also part of the Poor People's Campaign. As members of the clergy and religious leaders, we know that the faith has been distorted in American public life by religious nationalism and extremism. Demonizes some neighbors and rallies others to attack poor people, dismiss systemic racism, reject LGBTQ people and women's rights, and declare that prayer in school, guns, building walls, and tax cuts values issues. Poor people of every race, creed, and sexuality have suffered from these distortions of faith and moral values. But further, as Dr. King just said, they are used to divide the very poor people that should be united to build a beloved community. When you are elected president.
We can't endorse it. Not in the house.
How would you use your influence to shift the moral narrative in our public life, to unify and build power for poor and low-wealth people?
Thank you, and it's a great note to end on, because the central idea of my campaign is the idea of belonging. And we live with so many patterns of exclusion right now in this country. People are excluded in overlapping and multiple ways, based on economics, based on race, based on religion, sexuality, whatever it is. And I believe it's amounted to a crisis of belonging. Now, our Constitution protects people of every religion and of no religion equally. That's core to how this nation was set up. But I also believe that it matters that we have a president who does not give people of faith reason to scratch their heads and say, whatever happened to, I was hungry and you fed me. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And while I would impose my religious faith on nobody else, I will be transparent about the fact that I follow a God who came into this world not in riches but in poverty, not as a citizen but as a refugee, not as a political authority but as a political dissident who died for it. And that instructs my sense of how salvation, for me at least, has to do with how I will make myself useful to those who are oppressed and those who are marginalized and those who are on the edges and those who are poor. Because I can't count the number of times the word poor shows up in Scripture. It's an awful lot.
2,000.
I knew somebody in here might know.
He's counted. 2,000 with poverty, how you treat women, treat children, treat the immigrant, and resist idolatry with the worship of things rather than the love of people. More than 2,000 scriptures in the Bible. Well, Mayor Pete, thank you for coming. Two quick things as we calm down. We asked every candidate that came to the Moral Poverty Action Congress if they would push and commit to and say that in America we needed a debate. We're pushing for now, we're working with, called a Conversation with American Families. We're dealing with the issue of systemic poverty and how systemic racism and poverty intersect, not just about black people, but in terms of all people. And we asked them on the record, would they commit, would they come, would they push for that debate around poverty that has not happened? And so I want, on behalf of the Poor People's Campaign, to offer you that same question to find out if you would commit to help us push for that in this election cycle.
You can count on it.
All right.
We've also got...
And can someone move this to trustee? We got some young people here. Where are they? They want to give you something. Some young people, they have a copy of the poverty. Is that where we at? We have a copy of the executive summary of the audit and the poor people's justice budget. And this young man, you supposed to do it? Well, you can take it up.
Come on.
Yeah, come on. And we're going to send your staff the full document, but we wanted you to have the executive summary because we are a movement that we don't believe in being loud and wrong. We believe empirical data has to go with emotional fervor if we're ever going to have economic justice. Can we thank the mayor for coming and spending this kind of time? Okay. If you would remain still as... And shake the hand I do and tell them I'm glad you put up with me this long. And for those of you who've never been in church this long, say hallelujah.